So it's a real pleasure to be here doing one of my favourite things, actually, which is talking to non-specialists about something that I've worked on for many, many years and trying to encourage you to believe that this is important and relevant, and then hopefully you will go and spread this message. And I think hopefully by the end of this short presentation, you'll see the relevance of mass extinctions to today's society and go and tell people about it. So what we're going to look at today is one particular mass extinction, which we'll come on to shortly, and examine the relationship between volcanic eruptions, and Christian will talk after me about meteorite impacts, but the relationship for me between volcanic eruptions and mass extinctions. And as I say, I'll try and link this to Earth's future, because we're entering a quite uncertain time in terms of climate change and the effect on the biosphere. Okay, so firstly, obviously the theme of this workshop is very broad, so I wanted to first of all start with what is an extinction. It might seem very obvious, and at the most basic, extinction of a species is when the last individual of that species dies out. So here's a nice example. These are passenger pigeons, which were once amongst the most numerous birds in the skies above North America, and they were hunted to extinction. So there's one mechanism by which humans can induce an extinction, and the last individual died out in 1914, so the passenger pigeon as a species then became extinct. So that's simple enough, but now it gets more complicated. What is a mass extinction? A nice iconic image from National Geographic here of the dinosaurs suffering their demise. But what is a mass extinction? It's a term that people like me use very broadly, and actually there's no fixed definition. But in general, we might use this definition by Jakosky, who was one of the pioneers of mass extinction work in the 1970s and 80s. And generally, he said that a mass extinction was a substantial increase in the amount of extinction suffered by more than one geographically widespread higher taxon during a relatively short interval of geological time. Now, the problem with this is there are so many subjective terms in there. What is a relatively short interval of geological time, for instance? Are we talking 100 years, 1 million years, 10 million years? Nobody really knows. So that gives license to call lots of things mass extinctions. But in general, we tend to assume a real mass extinction is where 50% or more of species in a globally widespread area have disappeared fairly quickly. Okay, so what is meant by higher taxon? So here is something that I'm sure you're all familiar with, Linnaean classification. Starting from the base of the tree here, we have species. This example is for the roses, the moss rose, Rosa gallica. And then we have genera, families, orders, classes, phylums, and kingdoms. So to generate a mass extinction, we can't just wipe out the moss rose. That's bad for the moss rose, right? But it's not going to be a mass extinction. We have to be taking out numerous genera, families, and orders, and perhaps even classes. Hopefully not at the kingdom level, otherwise we are very much doomed. So, how to get this idea, this concept across to school children, for instance? I like to use an example of cars, because everyone's familiar with cars. So here we have a family tree for the Fords, perhaps not so popular in Austria, but quite popular in the UK. So we have multiple species here at time interval 1. We have the Sierra, the Fiesta, the T, the Focus, which I drive, a very old Focus, which is about to become extinct, the Capri, and the Transit. Now, these species live in the genus Forda, which is in the family, the Motorcaridae, the motor cars. Let's get rid of some. So actually, we've lost some species by now. These are the extant, the still living species. We still have the Fiesta, the Focus, and the Transit on our roads, but we no longer have the Sierra, the T, or the Capri. So quick question for you then. What's our mass extinction level here? How many species have we lost? Somebody, I think, thank you. 50%. So that's a mass extinction. So generally, you can see we've got a mass extinction of 50% of species, but actually we've still got the Fords and we've still got the motor cars. So we haven't wiped out any genera or families here. So actually, this isn't really a mass extinction. We have to wipe out lots and lots and lots of species before we can even begin to think about wiping out genera and families. And actually, without extinction, of course, there is no evolution. Without wiping out the dinosaurs, we wouldn't be here today. And in the time since the T and the Sierra have disappeared, Fords, of course, they have to make lots of money, so they make new cars, have radiated. So we now have things like the S-Max and the car and the 350. So there's no diversity loss at all in terms of the diversity at species level in Fords. Okay, so turning our head to the animal kingdom then, these are Jakosky and Dave Raup, who were the pioneers really of extinction studies in the 1970s and 80s at the University of Chicago, and they built up databases of all known occurrences of species, genera, families, etc. And their work really triggered a revolution in this science. And this is one of their early figures. This is geological time at the bottom, going from the Cambrian explosion of life, and then quickly new species radiating. This is actually marine genera here through time, up to the present day. And what they noticed on this figure, you can see with my thunderbolts, of 5 occurrences where there was a big and rapid decline in the generic diversity of life on Earth. And these were their big 5 mass extinctions, as they called them. So if you put those into a Premier League table, the end Permian, which is the one I'll talk about today, sits way on top. Around about 96% of species disappeared. End Triassic, End Cretaceous, Late Devonian, and End Ordovician are the other 4 members of the Big 5. And these are all globally widespread, severe crises for life on Earth. It'll be interesting to talk a little bit about the Anthropocene. I think your workshop comes back to the Anthropocene later. At the moment, we've seen 0% of species lost. Yes, we have a few species that have disappeared in the past few hundreds of years, but actually in the grand scheme of things, if we round it down, we still have 0%. But this is still something to think about in the future. If we put those onto a nice geological time spiral, which I'm sure you've seen one of these before, going from the formation of the Earth right round to the present day. It's a nice way of depicting geological time to non-specialists. And you can see those big 5 are the red splodges on here. There are numerous lesser calamities, so smaller mass extinctions represented by the yellow zigzags here. But the big 5 and most of those lesser calamities you'll see happened within a long time period. But then since then, this is the early Jurassic, is that last yellow blob up there. Since then, Earth has actually been fairly benign in terms of mass extinctions, with the obvious exception of the one that wiped out most of the dinosaurs at the end of the Cretaceous there, which is a particularly unique event. So actually, something's happened to Earth, perhaps, that stopped it from suffering mass extinctions since that bombardment of extinction events through that 300 or so million year period there. Put a little red flag down at the bottom here. This is the Anthropocene, and this is what actually makes people these days interested in mass extinctions, the realization that Earth is perhaps entering another one of these phases. So this is a famous diagram. This is Tony Barnowski's work, a few years old now, from Nature. This is modern different animal groups, and there are a number of figures on here. This is the number of species of each group extinct in the past 500 years. So you see for the amphibians, which are thought to be one of the most at-risk groups from extinction, only 1% of amphibian species have actually disappeared in the past 500 years. So the numbers are still quite low. If we look at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN, species that are assessed and are categorized at being at risk of extinction, the numbers become a lot more worrying. So for scleractinian corals, for instance, this is a nice little brain coral, 27% of corals are considered to be at risk of extinction. There are some much bigger number on here. Gastropods, for instance, the number of gastropods considered to be at a risk of extinction is 56%. But this is somewhat inflated. Only 3% of total species have been assessed. So some of these numbers you have to take with a pinch of salt. It's much nicer to assess things like pandas than boring little sea snails. Still, none of these figures are yet approaching these, which are the thresholds, really. These are the big 5 mass extinctions. But it's still a really good way of showing people why we should be interested in past mass extinctions in the context of future Earth. Are we living, this is a question that I think the workshop comes back to later, are we living in a new geological age characterized by human-induced extinctions? And the Anthropocene as a concept is really interesting. This is a potential marker for the base of it. This is the Trinity test and the first release of carbon-14, radioactive carbon, into the world's environments. As geologists, we always have to have a pinpoint somewhere on the planet that marks the base of each geological stage, period, etc., as we divide geological time. And this could be the pinpoint for the new geological age, the Anthropocene. So we know that extinction has happened before. That's clear from the fossil record. So in theory, if we apply principles that have stood geologists well for centuries, if it's happened before, it could happen again. The question is, what might it look like? So let's have a look at a past example. So here's a slide that you won't really perhaps be able to appreciate from the back. It's not a very exciting one, but the reason I put this up is that you can analyze the fossil record in many different ways. And depending on your agenda, you can use statistics, as I'm sure you all know, to support a particular argument. So these are league tables of extinctions in percentage of marine genera going extinct. And there are lots of different extinction events on here, and these are from different authors. But what's clear is that whichever way you look at the data, the end Permian or the Permian-Triassic mass extinction stands out clearly as the most severe crisis that's ever affected the planet. So it's the one we'll look at in this talk. So you could call this something like out of the frying pan and into the fire. This was a time when the Earth was very, very hot, and that could be one of the reasons why life suffered so badly. Volcanism is a key theme in this talk, of course, but I'd just like to point out that when the Discovery Channel made a DVD of this, volcanoes weren't exciting enough for the cover of the DVD box set. They had to have a meteorite impact on there. There is no evidence of meteorite impact at all during this event. So what did the world look like? Very different, and you've seen some plate tectonics already. And here is the tectonic reconstruction, or the paleogeographic reconstruction of the late Permian world. And one thing's really interesting is that actually back then the world was all put together as one great big landmass, by and large, called Pangaea. You could actually walk from the South Pole to the North Pole without getting your feet wet at this time. It really is a very unique time in Earth history. One of the great things about being a geologist, and if you have students that you teach, you can tell them that they should go on to become geologists, or geographers, but it's not as good, because it takes you to see the world. You go to some fantastic places, never as a tourist. You go there to work, you meet really interesting people, you get to see some amazing scenery, some unusual scenery. If, like me, you sort of get into some difficult situations, then at least if you survive them, gives you some stories to tell the next generation. So there's some beautiful places where you can go and look at the Permian-Triassic extinction. This is Bolzano in the Dolomites of northern Italy, wonderful place. This is the Buk Mountains, not far from here, over the border in Hungary. That's me there, looking much, much thinner, being filmed for Hungarian television. Far more diverse places than you could ever imagine. And when I was 18, wondering what I would do with my life, I never thought I'd go to places like this. We have Tibet, Spitsbergen, where I've been spending many of the past few summers, Japan, Turkey, which is the site of the talk I'm giving in a session on mass extinctions tomorrow. Ellesmere Island, which is Arctic Canada, again a wonderful place. I was there a couple of summers ago with the record-breaking temperatures. Would you believe I was at 82 degrees north and the temperature was 25 degrees C? Really interesting times in the Arctic. Greenland, such fabulous places as Idaho with its famous potatoes. So, it takes you all around the world, and it's a great thing to say to school children is go and do something like this because you never know where it will take you. Victims on land. So this is a nice reconstruction of what the Permian-Triassic boundary land surface would have looked like. This is pre-dinosaurs. So the main things walking around on land are things like the pariasaurs, which are the cheek lizards. These are herbivorous Permian reptiles. They're about the size of a large pig. The gorgonopsids, which look a bit meaner. And these are the top predators. These are the top Permian therapsids, and they'd go around eating whatever they could get their hands on. And these things, the gymnosperms, or the naked seed plants and trees. This particular one is Glossopteris, which actually form most of the world's economically important coals. So in the UK, most of our coal is carboniferous in age, but in larger parts of the world, there's a huge amount of late Permian coal, which all formed from this tree Glossopteris, which disappeared in this extinction event. There's a gap in the coal record, there's a gap in many records after this extinction, but one of the famous gaps is the coal gap, because this important tree was wiped out. It's the only mass extinction of insects. So insects, incredibly diverse and robust group. If you've ever tried whacking a cockroach with a shoe in a tent at night, you'll notice that, and I don't advocate that, I love all animals, but you'll notice that it's really, really hard to wipe these things out. So this event must have been pretty catastrophic to wipe out many, many insect species. In the oceans, it's a similar story, widespread catastrophe. Almost all groups were affected. And as I said earlier, if we add it all up, about 96% of all species globally became extinct. It truly was the day that the Earth nearly died, or it's probably a bit longer than a day, but it was a very catastrophic time. So in terms of how fast this was, this is just a range chart. These are individual species. This is how we depict these things as geologists. And when the species disappears, its grey bar, in this case, also stops. So it's been thought more recently that there are actually two pulses, two phases to this extinction event, a latest Permian extinction and an earliest Triassic extinction. This has actually been challenged by several workers who maintain that there's a single pulse of abrupt extinction. Whichever way you look at it, it's relatively short-lived. So a few years ago, when this figure came out in 2013, they thought that these two extinction pulses were separated by about 180,000 years. Now, our science is moving on really, really fast, and the clever people who can actually date rocks for us have recently got much more refined dates for these rocks, and actually say that at most, even incorporating significant error bars, this extinction event took somewhere in the region of 60,000 years, but it was probably much more rapid than that. This is probably a fairly quick catastrophe for the biosphere. So let's have a look at some of the possible candidates for what drove this extinction. How nasty did it get? And this is a nice figure from a friend of mine, Yadong Sun, published in Science in 2012, looking at terrestrial tetrapods, so things walking around on land. This is in the aftermath of the extinction, and then fish in the seas. And what he noticed was that the record of these things in the tropics basically disappears. So coupled with some clever oxygen isotope data, they found that actually tropical oceans simply became too hot, around about 45 degrees C in the sea surface temperature of the tropical oceans. Now that's a very, very hot bath, not very pleasant, and most things cannot reproduce at temperatures above 37, 38 degrees. That's why we are built the way we are. So the theory is that it just became so hot on land and in the oceans that the ranges of these things were all pushed out towards the poles. So it's a hot world, no doubt about that. Probably caused, almost certainly caused, by carbon dioxide emissions, driving this extreme global warming. Now, there was a theory that came out, the Henrik Svensson hypothesis, was that the lavas that were erupting, and I'll show you what the ultimate driver is, comes back to volcanism, in Siberia, were also burning coal. They were coming through a basin of coal and evaporites, which added not only the volcanic carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, but also the carbon dioxide generated by burning of fossil fuels, which is why this is quite relevant to the modern day. Some other nasty things that have been proposed for this extinction event: ocean acidification, or more correctly, reduced pH in the ocean, driving this extinction event. Toxic metals, things like mercury. There's a big spike in the record of mercury in rocks of this age, so presumably mercury was being emitted into the atmosphere from volcanoes. It's quite a poisonous metal, of course, so that could also be implicated in this extinction event. Acid rain and ozone loss has been proposed a little bit more recently, caused by volcanic gases again. So volcanic gases put out the same sorts of things that fridges used to put out a few years ago, and we all know the damage that was done to the ozone layer there. This is a much bigger scale ozone damage, which is really bad for things living on land, and also acid rain is really bad if it gets into the ocean in sufficient quantities to acidify the ocean. So there's quite a bit of evidence that vinegar-like acid rain was falling during this event, and also the enhanced ultraviolet B radiation, which is bad for things on land, caused mutations and failures to reproduce and so on and so forth. A bit of a contrast, there was a paper that came out last year suggesting that actually there wasn't all this global warming and associated nastiness going on. There was actually an ice age. Now, I don't subscribe to this hypothesis, but it does show you that people are coming out with all sorts of different ideas for this extinction event. So what's the culprit for all these nasty things? As I say earlier, it's probably not a meteorite impact in this event. It's this thing. These are the Siberian Traps. Now, trap, I don't know if anyone here is from Sweden, but traps is a Swedish word and means ladder or staircase, and it reflects the architecture of these large igneous province volcanic eruptions, just layer upon layer, huge quantities of lava spewing out onto the Earth's surface and building these staircases of volcanic rock. In terms of size or volume, these eruptions erupted 6 million cubic kilometers of lava. Now, what's that? I mean, how many swimming pools is that? Well, it's a lot. And actually, if we think about the size of Austria, where we all are today, it's enough lava to bury the whole of Austria, including the convention centre, unfortunately, 71.5 kilometers deep in lava. So think about that. That's the whole of Austria covered in 71.5 kilometers of lava. This is massive. This isn't just some sort of historical eruption like Laki or Pinatubo. These are the sorts of eruptions that happen infrequently, but cause massive, or can cause massive levels of destabilization to the Earth's atmosphere and its oceans. So, total carbon dioxide released by these eruptions was about 30,000 gigatons. That's about 10 times the amount of carbon dioxide in today's atmosphere, and we'll come back to that shortly. Here's a little map. This just shows why these volcanic rocks weren't really identified until relatively recently. It's because they're hidden way up in the north of Siberia. This is Norilsk here and Tomsk, so this is Lake Baikal for size. You should know that Lake Baikal is the largest lake in the world, but look at the outcrop of these volcanic rocks and see how they dwarf Lake Baikal there. They're actually discovered mainly through drilling for oil and gas and coal, economically important deposits in the north of Russia. There have been several large igneous province eruptions. This isn't an isolated event. This is a map showing different large igneous province eruptions that have erupted at different times in Earth's history, some of which have associated mass extinctions with them. So Camp is the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And this is thought to coincide and be one of the drivers of the end Triassic mass extinction. The Deccan Traps in India coincide with the Cretaceous Tertiary or Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, which also, of course, has the famous meteorite impact associated with it as well. But we have several really big ones. So you see the Siberian Traps at the top there, but what about Kerguelen and Ontong Java? These are some of the largest volcanic eruptions ever, and these have little or no associated climate changes or mass extinctions with them. So not all large igneous provinces coincide with mass extinctions. This is something to bear in mind. And it's probably to do with changing Earth since the time of Pangaea, but also to do with where these things erupt. What rocks do they erupt into? These happen to erupt into the ocean, on the ocean floor. So perhaps their climate changing effects are somewhat tempered by the site of eruption. Anyway, as I mentioned, the particular volcanic rocks in Siberia erupted into some coals, and this was picked up by the news internationally, how fossil fuel burning nearly wiped out life on Earth 250 million years ago. And there are some scientific papers, of course, that support and show the evidence for the burning of coal in the latest Permian. This is a little video. This is in our chemistry lab at Hull, something that, depending on the health and safety regulations in your country, you might be able to do with school children. I like to try and do fun things. This is the thermite reaction, and at the bottom of this test tube here, we have a lump of coal. So I wanted to test if this theory was plausible. So make some lava, chuck it on some coal and see what happens. Unfortunately, that happened, and I got into lots of trouble. But it did make a fire, which was nice, and it did make smoke, which went all over the lab, and it did disperse fly ash, which is the burning products of coal, all over the lab. So it seemed to work, which is great fun. It's just something nice to do. You know, you could do this in the classroom. Nobody will forget it, including the health and safety officer, in my case. So just to pull the Permian-Triassic mass extinction back together, and then we'll talk about the modern Earth and its future. This slide, which I'm sure will be available to you afterwards if you can download the presentation, summarizes the kind of cause and effect relationships between the Siberian Traps eruptions at the top there, and then at the bottom here, the terrestrial and marine mass extinctions. So the products of volcanism are sulfur dioxide. Now, sulfur dioxide, I've talked a bit about warming. Sulfur dioxide actually induces short-term cooling. So when Pinatubo did erupt in 1991, there was a global cooling of about 0.5 degrees, not very much, but that was because sulfur dioxide forms particles in the atmosphere that block out sunlight over fairly short periods, because soon enough that forms sulfuric acid when SO2 reacts with water in the atmosphere, and it rains out. But in the short term, it can cause volcanic darkness, cooling, which in turn, the knock-on effect of darkness is photosynthetic shutdown. So that could do something bad, and it can also give us acid rain from H2SO4. Chlorine, fluorine, and oxides of nitrogen, NOx emissions, do the damage to the ozone layer. Toxic metal emissions directly poison things. So we've got mercury, but also other horrible metals like bromides and what have you, that could directly drive mass extinctions on land and in the oceans. Carbon dioxide emissions, which are the big one, driving global warming, which drives something that I haven't really discussed, which is ocean anoxia. This is the decrease in dissolved oxygen in the world's oceans that is particularly poisonous, and I'll mention that briefly in a moment. So CO2 is linked to the marine mass extinction through warming. And there's this thermogenic gas emissions, which is this burning of coal and putting much more CO2 and methane into the atmosphere, which also drives global warming and extinction. And finally, CO2 emissions can also drive ocean acidification, which is a big threat to the planet today, because it gets dissolved into seawater, drives bicarbonate and H+ ions to increase in seawater, driving ocean acidification. Afterwards, in the Triassic, we have, as I mentioned, several gaps in the geological record, coal gaps, reef gaps, and other gaps. There's a particularly strange survivor. This is Lystrosaurus. This is a painting by the American conceptual artist William Stout. And this is Lystrosaurus looking out over a barren Antarctica. Nobody knows why Lystrosaurus survived or how it survived. One thing that is important for paleontologists to think about is how can the record of what did survive inform our understanding of what drove the mass extinction, and that's work that's being carried out today. Shortly afterwards, as I said, there's no evolution without extinction. There was about a 10 million year long delayed recovery from this event, much longer than we see with other mass extinction events. But ultimately, this hot and inhospitable Earth started to get much wetter. So in the Triassic, about 20 million years later, we see this lush greening of Earth. Climate seems to get much more pleasant. And we see the evolution of the earliest dinosaur. This is Eoraptor, which evolved about 20 million years after the extinction at 231-ish million years. And I'm sure you'll find out more about these sorts of things, hopefully, in the next talk. I don't know, I'm maybe putting too much pressure on Christian, but you'll find out about meteorites and that sort of thing. So, let's recap. What's the effects of massive volcanic eruptions and how might they drive a mass extinction? Thermal stress, so this is long-term global warming in particular, but also short-term cooling. Marine anoxia, which, as I mentioned, is a direct result of warming. Ocean acidification, ozone damage, acid rain, and toxic metal poisoning. I've mentioned these things have all been implicated, but what do they actually do? And how are they linked? Now, I think all of these things have to be linked by atmospheric processes. So you put something into the atmosphere, and it's affecting things It's the only thing that really can affect things on land and in the ocean. It provides the obvious link. So as we're looking to see how these things all interact, we have to think about how the atmosphere drives those things. So speaking of today's atmosphere, well, this is actually April the 3rd, which is a few days ago now, but we're all well aware that CO2, this is at the Mauna Loa Observatory in the Pacific, and we're all well aware that CO2 is now above 400 ppm in the atmosphere and has been for several years now and isn't showing any signs of decline. It's still going up. So it's around about 409 ppm at the moment. So with that in mind, thinking of CO2, let's examine what the 3 most severe CO2-induced stresses do. That's warming, marine anoxia, and ocean acidification. So thermal stress. The IPCC predict that global ocean warming will be somewhere in the region of 1 to 6.5 degrees by 2100. So in the very short term, we could see the oceans warming up by 6.5 degrees. Now that's pretty severe. It's nowhere near the 15-degree warming associated with the Permian event, but this is happening over really short timescales. What does warming actually do? It increases the aerobic metabolism in animals. So the Q10 law for biologists suggests that with every 10 degrees C of temperature rise, metabolism doubles. Now this means that you need more oxygen to drive that metabolism. So stress occurs in an animal when the oxygen demand required by its metabolism exceeds its aerobic scope, exceeds its ability to actually take in oxygen. Active organisms, this is quite an interesting thing. So active organisms are things that can elevate their metabolic rate. So think of Usain Bolt. When he goes to sprint 100 meters, he's very, very active, but he's also increasing his metabolism for that short burst of time to allow him to be an elite athlete. If you compare an active organism like Usain with a less active organism like me, Usain would be much more likely to survive a mass extinction. And this is seen with things like fish that can move around, they're very active. They're much more likely to survive extinctions in the past geological record than things that can't move, like brachiopods that are just stuck there on the seafloor and can't elevate their metabolism. However, in the future, and this is lessons from the past, modest temperature rises of several degrees are unlikely to be the only killer in mass extinction scenarios. I think probably the extreme end Permian warming perhaps took life past a threshold at which it could survive. So once you get above 37, 40 degrees C in the oceans, then it's really hard for things to reproduce. And of course, yes, things move out towards the poles and their range extends north and southwards. But actually, if you're heating up those oceans to these sorts of temperatures, then there really is nowhere to hide. But I think on its own, temperature rise isn't going to drive a mass extinction of that order. What about marine anoxia? And this is a nice photo from Redondo Bay in America, where there was a mass killing of fish. And this has actually become quite a regular occurrence around the world, as the oxygen in the seawater there in the harbour all disappeared. Now, if we can extrapolate this over global oceans, we have a potentially very potent killer. Warm water holds less oxygen. Warm liquids, if you think about a bottle of Coke, when it's nice and cold, it's nice and fizzy, it's nice and warm, or not very nice and warm, it quickly goes flat. And that's because the carbon dioxide in that drink, when it's warm, it doesn't stay in solution. It comes out of solution. It's the same with seawater. Warm seas hold less oxygen. And at the same time, the animals living in those seas have increased oxygen demand because, as I've said, their metabolism's gone up. So this is a double whammy. This is bad. And prolonged exposure to anoxia of days or weeks causes pretty indiscriminate, non-selective death by asphyxia. So this is a very potent kill mechanism, nicely demonstrated by these poor fish here in California. However, at no point that we know of in the geological record, or certainly since the dawn of modern life, as it were, have the world's oceans become simultaneously anoxic everywhere. So we don't see any scenario in which all of the world's oceans are anoxic at the same time. So this is unlikely also to be the sole killer in mass extinction scenarios. What about increased carbon dioxide and its effect of reducing pH, also known as ocean acidification? So if we look at the IPCC predictions for the next century, this is by the 2090s, at worst they're predicting ocean pH to drop by 0.5, and that's felt worst in cold water, so the poles. So the Arctic Ocean is most at risk because it's colder, so it can dissolve more CO2 into that seawater. 0.5 is actually quite a lot of a decrease. Myself and colleagues in Hull have done some experiments, and this is also done, of course, many other places. It's very topical at the moment to see what are the effects of that sort of pH decrease on organisms. And it's quite clear that increased CO2, just not thinking of acidification, but just generally increasing the CO2 in an environment causes what's known as hypercapnia, and it's a decrease in the capacity of respiratory pigment to oxygenate tissues, and this leads to death. It's very bad. If we acidify the seawater, of course you'll have heard about the problems facing corals. Decreased pH makes it much more biologically costly to build a carbonate skeleton. So it's a big problem for anything that uses carbonate to build its skeleton, from corals right down to the base of the ecological pyramid, things like calcareous plankton, which are so important for regulating our carbon cycle. So it is a big issue. Rather interestingly, we've found that decreasing pH actually messes with fish's neurotransmitters. So this is work done in Hull. We dropped the pH from 8.1 to 7.7 for these fish. That's well within IPCC predictions. And these fish were then unable to detect predators, and also they were unable to detect their mates, so perhaps leading to a failure to reproduce and a higher possibility of them just being eaten. So possibly, here's a new sexy extinction theory for you, death by celibacy. Is this really what drives extinction? pH decrease leading to chemicals in the body being messed with? And actually, if you look at Andy Knoll's work, statistically, and this is I found really remarkable, losing 1% of individuals per generation can drive a species to extinction in little over a century. So instantaneously by geological standards. Theoretically, therefore, pH decrease could be the lone killer. So just a couple of minutes just to finish. Is life on Earth doomed? Some fun calculations to do back in the classroom. Let's go back to the Siberian Traps. The total mass of CO2 in today's atmosphere is that, which translates to 3,000 gigatons. As I said, the Siberian Traps released somewhere in the region of 30,000 gigatons. Now, this is very poorly constrained. Take it with a pinch of salt. But I liked it because I like working with tens, because I'm not very good at maths. I know that 3,000 is a tenth of 30,000. So, 30,000 over 3,000 is 10. So the traps emitted 10 times the modern CO2 atmospheric budget. Let's look at the record of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa over the past 50 years or so. Let's go back to 1968. I'm sure that was a very happy summer for those of you old enough to remember it. 323 parts per million. Those were the days. Can you imagine an atmosphere with only 323 parts per million CO2? Fast forward to this week, 409 parts per million. What's the difference? Well, in 50 years, CO2 has increased by 86 parts per million. That's 1.72 parts per million per year on average, although it's actually exponentially increasing in the past few years. So how long would it take the Earth's atmosphere to reach 10 times its present CO2? So we've got to get it from 409 to 4,090. We need to add 3,681 parts per million additional CO2 to the atmosphere. How long is that going to take? 2,140.116 years, which means catastrophe. I'm not a catastrophist in that sense, but catastrophe could strike in May 4158. Now, interestingly, I did this sum a few months ago, and we had a lot longer to live. So something's happened with the CO2 in the atmosphere in the past few months that's brought that doom day ahead by about 30 years, which is a bit scary. However, is this realistic, and could it all happen? And just to finish with, and put this into some perspective, this is 15 years old now, this figure. You'll have all heard of peak oil, and this was the world's use or reliance on different fossil fuels, such as crude and heavy oil, natural gas and coal. And then the development or replacement of those things with things like renewables, hydro, and to some extent nuclear power. And you can see that the prediction was that peak oil and the sort of reliance on these fossil fuels would start to disappear or decline in the next few decades, and renewables, as we hope, will take over in a much, much bigger way. And it's certain that these fossil fuels, even if humans are still alive in 2,000 years, will not be burnt or used in anywhere like the levels that they are at the moment. One other thing just to finish with, go back right to the start. Remember, something's happened to Earth since the Jurassic that's perhaps rendered it much less susceptible to extinctions. Maybe things living on Earth, things that have evolved since these great catastrophes, are just more resilient. But the other thing that's clear that's happened is Pangaea has broken up. That's the time of Pangaea there, and since the breakup of Pangaea, there's only been this one major mass extinction, and that's a particularly unique event, as you know. So perhaps Earth can take solace in the absence of a supercontinent. Perhaps that's one of the keys to protecting it from deadly climate change. And maybe also these things. So this is just a final slide. These are calcareous nanoplankton, which evolved in the Triassic in the aftermath of this great mass extinction. And they use carbon dioxide ultimately to create their skeletons, and they bury it in the ocean sinks of limestone. They're very, very important in regulating our world. So perhaps the evolution of these things is Earth's way of protecting it from another end Permian-style catastrophe. But for how long? And with that, I'll finish with a nice cartoon. Thank you.